Why reverse grids might not be as good as you think. Formula 1 did a survey of over 167,000 participants, and just over 6% thought that the introduction of sprint races in 2021 have improved the show. This is an extremely small percentage. The fact that they refer to it as a show and not motorsport, I think shows their clear intent in entertainment, and especially after the drama that happened last year, I think this is quite concerning. 43% of people said they would not be in favour of seeing sprint races held at every Grand Prix on the calendar, which looks like the way it's going. Now 6.7% in terms of if that was of the drivers on the grid would be about 1 in 20 drivers, so it's a very small percentage of people that actually want to see sprint races go ahead. Now it's clear that the fans don't want more sprint races, but I think it's inevitable with the amount of money that it's going to bring to Formula 1. They can sell more tickets, have bigger crowds on Friday, and they can actually charge more for tickets as there's sort of 3 main events across the weekend. So looking at Silverstone, last year at the National Pit Straights they were charging £329 for their seats, and it's gone up to £509, which is a huge increase in cost. Now they can clearly charge more money, and with the introduction of sprint races across the whole calendar, they can do this as they're providing more racing. So if people aren't in favour of sprint races in the current format, could there be a different change? And yeah, this video is going to be focusing on the reverse grid, which I've seen a lot of people talking about, but I think there are some things that should be considered. This quote by Prost said if they introduced the reverse grid, he would leave the sport. Now he's obviously not in the sport, he's talking about the work that he does with the sport, but a lot of drivers and people that work around Formula 1 think it's very gimmicky. But yeah, this looks like this is the way it's going to be going forward. So for you that don't know what a reverse grid is, let's say this was the current constructors' standings, Leclerc first, Verstappen second, Hamilton third, and so on, all the way down to sort of P19 and P20. Now in the reverse grid sprint race, you would take the reverse of the current constructors' standings at the time of the race and flip it. So P1 would go to P20, P2 would go to P19, and so on and so on. Now at first this looks really entertaining, having Stroll and Latifi on the front row and having people like Verstappen and Leclerc fighting from the back, but this video is going to go into why this may not be as good as you think. So we haven't actually seen a reverse grid in Formula 1. It is in other categories but not F1, but we have seen something similar. So in Monza, which is actually the last race for this video, we had a lot of drivers taking penalties. So we had Hamilton in P19, Sainz in P18, Perez P13 and Verstappen in P7. Now this is by no means a reverse grid, but this is a lot more unusual to have this many drivers starting towards the back end of the grid than we're normally used to. So how did this pan out in the race? So if we look at Hamilton there started in P19 and Sainz started P18, and then if you just look at their arrows, they just drop so quickly and they gain so many places. So by lap 12, Sainz was basically in P4, and Hamilton was a little bit slower to work his way through the field, but he still managed to finish up there in the top 5. Verstappen is that dark blue line that started in P7, and you can see by lap 5 about, he was already in 3rd or 2nd place, which he held for the rest of the race. Now, many of you that watch Monza, you may have thought it's probably one of the worst races of the season. I certainly thought so. It's very sort of processional. We didn't see many fights. There was a lot of sort of overtakes towards the start. They're just down the straights, DRS overtakes. It's not very interesting, to be honest, watching Max Verstappen fly past Kevin Magnussen with his DRS open in a Red Bull. It's not the racing we want to see. Now, if you ask me, I think 2021 was such a better season than 2022 in terms of racing, and that's mainly to do with Verstappen and Hamilton. Now, they were so close last season, and there were so many events like Silverstone, Imola, Monza, where there was just great racing between the two drivers. Now I think if you ask any Formula 1 fan, this was the sort of racing you want to see. Drivers in equal level and equal machinery fighting for wins or definitely for similar points. I'd rather watch Hamilton going up against Verstappen or Leclerc going up against Verstappen fighting for the win rather than seeing Verstappen pass 5 of the back markers at the start of a race to get first place. And this is why I think that reverse grids are avoiding the main issue with the racing if they don't think it is entertaining enough. So let's look at the current points from last season compared to this season currently. And if you look at 2021, look how close it was between Hamilton and Verstappen. The biggest gap for the whole season was 32 points. Now the current gap between Verstappen and Hamilton is 116 points, and we're only at round 16. If you look at 2021, they are basically on level on points, whereas back in 2021, the biggest gap was 32 points. Now this is what I think we need to see in Formula 1 to make the racing more entertaining. When you have a driver like Verstappen miles ahead, I don't find that it's that interesting to racing. Leclerc hasn't been able to fight him on strategy, and it's just made the racing a little bit dull. Now some people would say Verstappen has been more composed this season, but I would say he's just been not forced to drive so aggressive. He's probably, he's pushing the car to the limit, but he's not making dive bombs into corners and pushing drivers off tracks like he was doing in 2021. For example, this weekend at Singapore, if Verstappen was fighting Leclerc, he'd probably back out and take a second place, whereas last season it was sort of do or die. He wanted that first place, he needed that first place in order to beat Hamilton. This year he's got such a buffer, he could even retire from 3 or 4 races and still win the Drivers' Championship quite easily. So let's take this weekend at Singapore for example. I think on Friday you would have qualifying, which sets the grid for the race on Sunday, and on Saturday you would have a separate reverse grid sprint race. Now this is what the current reverse grid would look like. Latifi, Albon, Stroll, Zhou at the front, and then drivers like Perez, Verstappen, Leclerc starting at the back. Now, sprint races run to 100 kilometers, so depending on the F1 circuit, it will vary, but it's typically around 25 to 30 laps. Now, do you think Verstappen would be able to get up into the front of the grid within 30 laps? I think so quite easily. He did it in Monza. He got from 7th to 2nd in the space of about 4 laps. So I think he would find this pretty easy, and they typically have sprint races on tracks that are fairly easy to overtake. I think they could have them on tracks that are slightly more difficult, but that's something to consider. So reverse grids I don't think are the solution, and a lot of people say it's sort of artificial entertainment. Yes, it would be fun to see Verstappen starting from the back, but would this novelty wear off after seeing it after every race weekend if that's what we're going to tend towards? I think it'd be interesting at the start, but after a few races it would just become the normal. And what was the best race of this season? It was at Silverstone, when we had the likes of Hamilton in the Mercedes, Perez in the Red Bull, Leclerc in the Ferrari, all fighting for the win. It was really great racing, and it's always going to be more entertaining than seeing these drivers fighting back markers. And we also had the likes of sort of the McLarens and Alpines having the pace to potentially get up onto the podium. This is what I want to see in Formula 1, not Verstappen versus Latifi and Stroll. So what are the advantages to sprint races? Because I definitely think there are some. I think it would be something new or different, and I'm open to anything in Formula 1. I think everything deserves its opportunity, and I wouldn't be against them potentially adding one reverse grid race weekend to the sprint race next season, just to see how it unfolds, but I don't think this is a long-term solution. I think it would provide some short-term entertainment, but I think this novelty could wear off quite quickly, but I do think it would be interesting to see, and I'm not going to argue that it wouldn't be entertaining. it would allow the worst cars a chance to defend from the better drivers. So people like Latifi and Mick Schumacher, for example, often at the back of the field, and they don't really have anyone to defend against. Now, it'd be interesting to see these drivers defending against the top drivers like Verstappen's and Leclerc's, to see if that's where their talents may lie, and it would be quite interesting to see if they could hold back these drivers. And finally, I think this is probably the main advantage: it would break up the sprint race format. I don't think anyone likes the fact that quali sets the grid for the sprint race, which sets the grid for the Grand Prix. I think everyone likes qualifying setting the grid for the Grand Prix, and I think sprint races should be kept separate. So what are the disadvantages to reverse grids? Now, the main one is people will say it's very artificial. You're applying to sort of something completely out of the blue just to make the race more exciting. Drivers, they haven't qualified in that position, they don't really have a right to be there, but by completely flipping it, it would make things more entertaining. Another disadvantage, I think it ignores the real problem. We want to see drivers at equal level and equal machinery fighting wheel to wheel for race wins, and this isn't going to sort of fix that problem. Another disadvantage is F1 is different to F2 and F3. Now, we see reverse grids in these series, but they're also spec series. I would argue that the gap in F1 between the cars is much greater, so these races wouldn't be as close, and the drivers at the back, in the Ferraris, in the Red Bulls, would absolutely fly past the Williams, probably in about 10 laps. And the final disadvantage is I think it rewards poor performance slightly. So drivers or teams like Williams, Alfa Romeo, who aren't doing that great at the moment, they're going to get rewarded by starting towards the front of the grid and a chance to earn points. Is this fair on the teams in the midfield that have been fighting and developing a better car? I don't really think so. I think it shouldn't be sort of awarded points in this way. So that's the end of the video. Let me know your thoughts down below on the reverse grid sprint race format. Do you think you'd be a good addition, a bad addition to Formula 1, and would you want to see it potentially maybe at 1 or 2 races next season? If you're not following me on Twitter, my @ is Dan_OTG, and you can also follow me on TikTok at OffTheGridF1. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe. There's going to be a lot more content coming out on this channel, and I'll see you all again soon. Cheers for watching.